Your mom told everyone you're still unemployed and living off credit cards. My cousin Jennifer's words hit me like ice water through the phone as I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor of Cascade Technologies in downtown Seattle, staring out at the rain-streaked windows that frame the city skyline. I was the director of digital strategy, pulling in $180,000 a year, leading a team of 12 incredibly talented people, and I had just finished a presentation to our executive board about the Q3 campaign that generated $4.2 million in revenue. But none of that mattered to my mother. None of it had ever mattered. I thanked Jennifer for telling me and ended the call, my hands shaking as I set the phone down on my desk, next to the nameplate that read, Sarah Mitchell, Director of Digital Strategy, 3 years. For 3 years, I had been trying to get my mother to understand what I did, to see me, to acknowledge that I had built something real and valuable with my career. Every phone call home, every visit, every family gathering, I tried to share my wins, my promotions, the milestones that meant something to me. And every single time, she dismissed it as computer stuff, or changed the subject, or, and this was her specialty, started talking about my younger brother Marcus. Marcus, who worked in sales for a mid-sized insurance company and made about $70,000 a year, which was a perfectly respectable salary, but nowhere near mine. Marcus, who still lived in our hometown of Bellingham, just 20 minutes from our parents. Marcus, who could do no wrong in our mother's eyes. I remembered the dinner 3 weeks ago when I drove the 3 hours home to visit, when I walked in the door and announced that I'd been promoted to director, that this was a huge step in my career, that I was being featured in an upcoming issue of Tech Strategy Journal. My mother had looked at me for maybe 2 seconds before turning to Marcus and spending the next 20 minutes gushing about how he'd hit his sales quota for the 3rd month in a row. 20 minutes of praise for my brother while I sat there with my announcement hanging in the air like smoke, dissipating into nothing. My father had patted my hand under the table, a silent gesture that was supposed to convey support, but really just conveyed his unwillingness to say anything that might contradict my mother. "You know how she is," he'd told me later when I cornered him in the kitchen, my voice tight with hurt. "She doesn't mean anything by it." But she did mean something by it. She meant that what I did wasn't real to her, wasn't valuable, wasn't worth her attention or pride. And now, apparently, she'd decided it didn't exist at all. The pattern had been building for 3 years, ever since I graduated from the University of Washington with my degree in digital marketing and business strategy, and landed my first job at Cascade Technologies as a digital strategist making $95,000 a year, which felt like an impossible amount of money to 26-year-old me, who had lived on ramen and student loans for 4 years. I remembered calling my mother that day, breathless with excitement, and hearing her say, "That's nice, honey," before immediately pivoting to tell me about how Marcus had just gotten a certificate of achievement at his company's sales training program. When I tried to explain what my job would entail, leading digital campaigns for major clients, strategizing social media presence for Fortune 500 companies, she'd interrupted to ask if I'd seen the article she emailed me about nursing programs in the Seattle area. "It's not too late to go back to school for something stable," she'd said, and I had felt something inside me deflate like a balloon losing air. Over the following months and years, I kept trying. When I led my first major campaign that brought in $1.8 million in new revenue for our client, I called home and my mother told the neighbor who was visiting that I was still figuring things out, and between opportunities, even though I was sitting in my office at that very moment with a promotion letter on my desk. She sent me articles constantly, forwarded links about teaching programs and nursing schools and administrative careers, always with little notes like, "Just something to think about," or "Seems like a good path." She never once visited my apartment in Seattle, the one-bedroom place in Capitol Hill that cost me $2,400 a month, but had exposed brick and huge windows and made me feel like I was actually an adult with a real life, even though that rent consumed a significant portion of my take-home pay because Seattle wasn't cheap, and I was building a life in one of the most expensive cities on the West Coast. But she drove 4 hours each way to visit Marcus at least once a month, sometimes twice, bringing him casserole dishes and homemade cookies, and staying for entire weekends. Last Thanksgiving, I had tried one more time to explain what I did, to make her understand that I was managing a team of 6 people by then, that I was developing comprehensive digital strategies for companies whose names she would recognize, that I had been promoted twice in 2 years. I was sitting at the dining room table we'd eaten at since I was 5 years old, and I was explaining how digital strategy worked, how we analyzed consumer behavior and market trends, and created targeted campaigns across multiple platforms. And I looked over mid-sentence to see that my mother's eyes were closed, and her head was tilted back slightly, and she was asleep. She had literally fallen asleep while I was talking about my career. My father had noticed me staring and given me that same uncomfortable look he always gave me, the one that said he saw what was happening but wasn't going to do anything about it. And later, when I confronted him while we were washing dishes, he dried his hands on a towel and said those same words that had become his refrain. "You know how she is." I stopped trying to share my professional wins after that Thanksgiving, stopped offering up pieces of my success for my mother to ignore or dismiss. And for a few months, I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need her validation, that I was an adult with a thriving career, and that should be enough. But then in February, my parents' car broke down and needed $3,000 in repairs that they didn't have in their savings, and I sent them the money immediately through Venmo without even thinking about it, transferred it the same day they mentioned the problem because I could afford to help, and they were my parents, and that's what you did for family. 2 days later, my mother called Marcus and thanked him profusely for his generosity, told him he was such a thoughtful son, and they didn't know what they would have done without him. And when I called to ask if they'd received my transfer, she said, "Oh, yes, honey, thank you," in the same tone she might use to acknowledge that I'd passed the salt at dinner, and then spent 15 minutes telling me about the $200 Marcus had sent. The $200 he sent after I'd already covered the entire repair cost. That was when I started noticing how the extended family treated me at gatherings. The sympathetic looks and careful conversations, the way my Aunt Carol asked if I needed help updating my resume, the way my Uncle Don mentioned that his friend Steve managed a Target and they were hiring for their electronics department if I was interested. They were treating me with pity, with the gentle concern you'd show someone who was struggling and too proud to ask for help. And I realized that my mother hadn't just been dismissing my career to my face. She'd been systematically telling everyone in our family that I was failing at life. I sat in my therapist's office on a rainy Wednesday afternoon in March, Dr. Sandra Chen's space with its comfortable chairs and the abstract painting that I'd stared at for 2 years of biweekly sessions, and I told her everything. The words spilling out in a rush that surprised me with its intensity. "I keep trying to get her to see me," I said, and my voice cracked on the last word. "I keep thinking if I just achieve enough, if I just get one more promotion, or land one more major client, or get featured in one more publication, she'll finally acknowledge that what I do is real and valuable." Dr. Chen looked at me with that particular expression of hers that meant she was about to say something I needed to hear but didn't want to. "Sarah, you're seeking external validation from someone who has proven, repeatedly, that she's either unable or unwilling to provide it. At what point do you give yourself permission to stop trying?" I didn't have an answer for that, but the question sat in my chest like a weight for the next 2 weeks. Until the invitation arrived for the family reunion my mother was organizing, a big backyard party at my parents' house for 50-plus relatives, scheduled for the first Saturday in June. And I held that invitation in my hands and felt something shift inside me. Some decision point approaching that I couldn't quite see yet, but knew was coming. 2 weeks before the reunion, I made the 3-hour drive home on a Saturday afternoon to surprise my parents with a visit, telling myself I wanted to see them, but knowing deep down I was still trying, still hoping that maybe this time would be different, that maybe I could break through whatever wall existed between my reality and my mother's perception of it. I let myself in through the front door with my old key and called out, "I'm here!" and heard my mother's voice from the kitchen saying, "Just a minute, Linda," and I realized she was on the phone. I walked toward the kitchen to say hello and stopped in the doorway when I heard her say my name. "Sarah's still pretending to have that computer job," my mother said, her voice carrying that particular tone of concerned exasperation that I'd heard her use when talking about distant relatives with problems. "I think she's actually unemployed and too proud to admit it. She's always been stubborn that way. I just don't know how to help her if she won't be honest with us." I stood frozen in the doorway, my overnight bag still hanging from my shoulder, and felt something crack inside my chest. "Don't mention it at the reunion," my mother continued. "She's sensitive about being a failure. I don't want her to feel worse than she already does. Just be kind to her, you know?" I must have made some sound because my mother turned around and saw me standing there, and her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, and then something that might have been guilt, and then a strange kind of defensive concern. She told Aunt Linda she had to go and ended the call and said, "Sarah, honey, I didn't know you were coming." And I heard myself say very quietly, "I have a real job, Mom. I'm successful." She sighed and set her phone down on the counter and looked at me with that same pitying expression I'd seen on my relatives' faces. "Honey, if you were really successful, you'd have something to show for it. Look at Marcus. He just bought a house." I felt tears burning behind my eyes and forced them back. "Marcus bought that house with Jennifer's inheritance money from her grandmother. You know that. And I pay $2,400 a month for my apartment in Seattle because that's what it costs to live in a major city where I have a career." My mother shook her head slowly. "Maybe you should move home for a while. Save some money. Figure things out. There's no shame in admitting when something isn't working." I stared at her and realized with a clarity that felt like cold water that she genuinely didn't believe me. That 3 years of telling her about my job, my promotions, my success had not made even the smallest dent in whatever narrative she'd constructed about my life. She actually thought I was lying, that I was unemployed and pretending otherwise out of pride or delusion, or whatever she'd decided explained the disconnect between what I told her and what she believed. I stayed for less than an hour, made an excuse about needing to get back to Seattle, and drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel and my mother's words playing on repeat in my head. "She's sensitive about being a failure." I drove back to Seattle that Saturday evening in a fog of devastation that felt almost physical, my chest tight and my eyes burning with tears I wouldn't let fall until I was safely inside my apartment. And when I finally walked through my door and saw my space with its modern furniture and the view of the city that I'd worked so hard to afford, I felt a dissonance so profound it made me dizzy. This disconnect between the life I was actually living and the failure my mother had convinced herself and everyone else that I was. I called Jessica on Sunday morning, and everything spilled out in a rush: the overheard phone call and my mother's words, and the way she'd looked at me with pity when I tried to tell her the truth. And Jessica was furious in a way I couldn't quite manage to be yet, her voice sharp with outrage as she said, "You need to show up at that reunion with your entire portfolio, with every piece of evidence of your success, and make them all see what they've been too blind to acknowledge." I resisted the idea at first, because it felt desperate, felt like the kind of thing someone would do who was still seeking approval, still begging to be seen, and I told myself I shouldn't have to prove myself, that my worth wasn't dependent on my family's recognition of it. But then on Monday afternoon, my cousin Rachel called, her voice gentle with concern, and said, "Hey, I heard you're going through a rough patch, and I just wanted to say, hang in there, things will get better, and if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." And I realized the narrative had spread through the entire family like a virus, that every single relative would be at that reunion believing I was unemployed and struggling and too proud to admit it. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable, This split between my professional identity that I'd built carefully over 3 years and my family's perception of me as a failure. And I couldn't reconcile the two realities, couldn't figure out how to exist in both spaces simultaneously. On Tuesday, I had a scheduled check in with Rebecca, my boss, a quarterly review that I'd been looking forward to before this weekend had turned everything upside down, and I sat in her corner office with its view even better than mine and tried to focus as she praised my work on the recent campaign that had exceeded all our projections. Your name came up in the executive meeting last week, Rebecca said, leaning back in her chair with a smile that suggested good news was coming. We're looking at VP track positions for next year's planning cycle, and you're on the shortlist. But before that, I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in speaking on a panel at the Tech Innovation Conference in August. It's a prestigious event, limited attendance, and they specifically requested speakers from our company. I immediately thought of you. I said yes, automatically, my mind still partially back in my parents' kitchen with my mother's words echoing. And then Rebecca said something about the visibility being good for my career trajectory, and suddenly an idea formed, fragile and half imagined, but persistent. What if my family could see me in my element? Not just hear me describe it, but actually witness the professional life I'd built. See me as my colleagues and industry peers saw me instead of through whatever distorted lens my mother had created. I left Rebecca's office that Tuesday, with the conference invitations still echoing in my mind, and something shifted in me during the elevator ride back down to my floor. Not anger exactly, but a kind of calm determination that felt like finally setting down a weight I'd been carrying for 3 years. I wasn't going to protect my mother from reality anymore. This wasn't about revenge or humiliation or proving anything to satisfy some wounded part of myself. It was simply about truth. I was done living in two separate realities, done being successful in Seattle and a failure everywhere else, done translating my accomplishments into smaller words that still wouldn't be heard. That evening after work, I stayed late in my corner office, the one I'd earned with the promotion to director last year, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Seattle skyline and made me feel on particularly hard days like I'd actually achieved something worth achieving. I positioned my phone carefully on my desk and took a photo that showed everything, the windows with the city spreading out behind me in the late afternoon light. My nameplate that read Sarah Mitchell, Director of Digital Strategy, in clean metal letters, the credenza behind me with the industry award my team had won last quarter. I took a dozen versions until I got one where the light was right and everything was visible and clear. Then I sat down at my computer and started gathering evidence like I was building a case, which I suppose I was. I took screenshots of my LinkedIn profile with its 500 plus connections and the recommendations from executives at companies my mother would recognize. Leaders in the industry praising my strategic thinking and innovative approaches. I found the photo from last September when I'd presented at our company's annual keynote in front of 300 attendees, standing on that stage with the presentation screen behind me showing metrics from the campaign that had generated $4.2 million in revenue. I pulled up the PDF of my published article in Tech Strategy Journal, the one that had taken me 2 months to write and that my mother had never asked to read, despite me mentioning it 3 times. I found my badge from the Digital Innovation Summit in San Francisco, the exclusive industry conference where attendance cost $3,000, and I'd been selected as a panelist to discuss emerging trends in digital strategy. I gathered all of it methodically, each piece of evidence a small proof of the life I'd actually been living while my mother told everyone I was unemployed and struggling. I didn't want to send any of it yet because timing mattered, and I needed to be strategic about this. Needed to think it through rather than act from emotion. The reunion was in 10 days, and I opened my email and sent my RSVP to my mother. I'll be there, looking forward to seeing everyone. Her response came back within an hour. Good, maybe you'll network. Someone might know about job openings. The week before the reunion felt like the universe conspiring to prove my point through an accumulation of final straws that would have been almost funny if they hadn't hurt so much. On Monday morning, I woke up to an email from my mother with the subject line, "Thought you might be interested." And when I opened it, I found a job listing for an administrative assistant position at a medical office in my hometown. Starting salary $38,000. And her message said, "This seems like something you could do. Good benefits. Let me know if you want me to put in a word." I stared at that email for a full 5 minutes, trying to process that my mother genuinely believed a $38,000 administrative assistant job was an appropriate suggestion for someone she claimed to know, someone she'd raised, and I deleted it without responding because what could I possibly say that I hadn't already said 100 times? On Wednesday, I received an email from Carol Henderson, one of my mother's longtime friends, with a message that made my stomach drop. "Your mother told me you're looking for work and going through a difficult time. I wanted to let you know my company is hiring for a reception position. It's entry level, but it's a start. I'd be happy to recommend you if you'd like to send me your resume." The pity embedded in every word was suffocating, and I closed my laptop without responding to that one either. Then on Thursday evening, my phone rang and it was Marcus, and I could hear the awkwardness in his voice immediately when he said, "Hey, so I wanted to talk to you about something." And there was a long pause before he continued with, "Mom's really worried about you, and I just want you to know that if you need money or help with anything, I can lend you some to get you through until you find something." Something in me snapped and I said, "Marcus, I make $180,000 a year. I was just promoted to senior director at $215,000. I lead a team of 12 people and I'm on the VP track at my company." And the silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped before he said, "Wait, what? Why doesn't Mom know this?" I laughed and it sounded bitter even to my own ears. "I've told her 100 times. I've told both of them. She doesn't hear it. She doesn't want to hear it." Marcus was quiet again, and then he said slowly, "I mean, I know Mom kind of dismisses your work sometimes, but I thought you were maybe exaggerating how bad it was." And I felt something break open in my chest, because even Marcus, who I'd thought understood at least partially, had assumed I was being dramatic. "She told the entire family I'm unemployed and living off credit cards," I said. "She's been telling them for months. Everyone at the reunion thinks I'm a failure." I could hear Marcus breathing, and then he said, "Jesus, Sarah, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was that bad. I should have paid more attention." And there was genuine remorse in his voice that made me soften slightly toward him, because at least he could see it now. At least he wasn't actively defending her. He offered to talk to Mom, to set her straight before the reunion, but I told him no, that this was mine to handle, that I was done with intermediaries and secondhand conversations, and I needed to confront this directly. We talked for another 20 minutes, and for the first time in years, I felt like Marcus actually heard me, actually understood that this wasn't sibling rivalry or me being oversensitive, but a real pattern of erasure that had been happening right in front of him. After we hung up, I sat on my couch looking out at the Seattle skyline and felt something like resolve settling into my bones. On Friday afternoon, I was in a meeting when my phone buzzed with an email notification, and when I glanced at the screen during a break, I saw it was from Rebecca with the subject line, "Congratulations," and my heart started pounding before I even opened it. "Sarah, I'm pleased to inform you that the board approved your promotion to senior director effective June 1st. Your new salary will be $215,000 with the compensation package we discussed. You've earned this through exceptional work and leadership. Let's schedule time next week to discuss your expanded responsibilities and team growth. Congratulations on this well-deserved recognition." I read the email 3 times sitting there in the conference room with my colleagues filtering back in from the break, and I felt tears prick at my eyes because this was real. This was my actual life, and somewhere 3 hours away, my mother was probably telling someone else that I was unemployed and struggling and making up stories about computer jobs that didn't exist. I left Seattle Friday afternoon and drove the 3 hours to my hometown because my mother had called 2 days earlier asking if I could come a day early to help set up for the reunion. And I'd said yes, even though some part of me knew it was a mistake, knew I was walking back into the same dynamic that had been crushing me for years. I arrived at my parents' house around 6 in the evening to find Marcus's car already in the driveway along with his wife Jennifer's SUV, and when I walked in carrying my overnight bag, I found them both sitting in the living room with drinks in their hands, looking relaxed and comfortable, while my mother fussed over them, asking if they needed anything else. She looked up when I came in and said, "Oh, good, you're here. Your father is setting up tables in the backyard, and I need someone to start folding napkins and arranging the chairs." And there was no greeting. No "how was your drive," just immediate assignment of tasks, like I was hired help rather than her daughter. Marcus caught my eye, and I could see the discomfort there, the new awareness he'd gained from our phone conversation. But he didn't say anything, and neither did I, because what was there to say that wouldn't sound petty? I spent the next 2 hours in the backyard folding cloth napkins into decorative shapes, while my mother directed me and repositioned chairs, and at one point I heard her inside on the phone with someone saying, "Sarah's coming tomorrow. Yes, she's actually here tonight helping set up. Please be kind to her. She's going through something difficult right now. No, she won't talk about it. Unemployment is hard and she's very sensitive about it." My hand started shaking as I folded the next napkin, and I had to set it down and breathe slowly because the breaking point was so close, I could feel it like a physical pressure in my chest. That evening we had dinner together, the five of us around the kitchen table, and my mother spent 20 minutes talking about how incredibly well Marcus was doing, about the new client he'd landed, and the award his sales team had won, and how proud she was of everything he'd accomplished. And then she turned to me with this pitying expression and said, "Any updates, sweetheart?" in a tone that made it clear she expected nothing. I looked at her across the table and said clearly and calmly, "I was promoted to senior director last week. My new salary is $215,000 a year." And she laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Honey, you don't have to make things up here. This is family. We love you no matter what." My father looked down at his plate, silent and uncomfortable, and Marcus started to say, "Mom, Sarah's not," but she cut him off with a wave of her hand and said, "Marcus, let's not enable her fantasies. It doesn't help." And then she turned back to me with genuine compassion in her eyes that made me want to scream and said, "Sarah, it's okay to be struggling. There's no shame in it. We all go through hard times and you're still young. You'll figure things out eventually." I excused myself from the table while my mother was still talking about realistic expectations and went upstairs to my childhood bedroom, the one that still had my high school debate team trophies on the shelf and a faded poster from a band I'd loved at 16, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark without turning on the light, because I couldn't bear to see the remnants of who I'd been when my mother still believed in me. The room felt suffocating, trapped in time, and I realized that's exactly how she saw me. Frozen at 17 before I'd gone away to college and become someone she couldn't understand or categorize or control through her limited framework of what success looked like. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of photos I'd compiled over the past week, scrolling through them slowly in the darkness with the screen illuminating my face. And each image felt like proof of a life my own mother refused to acknowledge existed. My corner office with the Seattle skyline stretched behind me, and my name on the door. The keynote presentation with 300 faces turned toward me listening. The published article with my headshot and credentials. The conference badge that cost more than some people's monthly rent. These weren't fantasies or exaggerations or desperate attempts to seem important. They were documentation of my actual reality, and tomorrow I was going to make everyone see what had been invisible to them because of one person's determined blindness. I texted Jessica, even though it was nearly 11. "Tomorrow I'm done being invisible." And her response came back within 30 seconds with 3 fire emojis and the words, "Burn it all down, show them who you really are, I'm so proud of you." That simple validation from someone who actually knew me and saw me clearly made tears spring to my eyes, and I sat there on my childhood bed crying quietly in the dark, because it shouldn't have had to come to this, shouldn't have required a dramatic public revelation, should have just been my mother asking questions and listening to answers and being proud of the daughter she'd raised. I opened my email and pulled up the family reunion listserv my mother had created for coordinating the event, all 53 relatives included, and I started composing a message with the photo of my office attached, writing and deleting and rewriting the caption a dozen times before settling on something simple and factual. Sarah Mitchell, Senior Director of Digital Strategy, Cascade Technologies, Seattle. My finger hovered over the send button, and I could feel my heart pounding, because once I sent this, there would be no taking it back, no pretending everything was fine, no protecting my mother from the consequences of her own narrative. But then I stopped and closed the email draft, because something in me wanted to give her one more chance. Wanted tomorrow at the reunion to offer her the opportunity to finally see me before I forced everyone else to see what she'd refused to acknowledge. I would go to the reunion, and if she persisted, if she continued to present me as a failure to our entire family, then the truth would come out, not as an attack, but as a necessary correction to a lie that had gone on far too long. I lay back on my narrow childhood bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling with my phone clutched in my hand, and I didn't sleep much that night, because I kept rehearsing what I would say, and how I would say it, and whether I had the courage to actually go through with exposing the gap between who I was and who my mother had decided I must be. The reunion started at noon on Saturday, and I arrived at exactly 12:15 because I didn't want to be early and help my mother with last-minute preparations, and I didn't want to be so late that my absence would be noted. And when I pulled up to my parents' house, I could see the backyard was already full of people, at least 50 relatives scattered across the lawn with paper plates and plastic cups. And I sat in my car for a full minute, gathering my courage before getting out. I'd dressed carefully that morning in a navy blazer and white blouse with tailored pants, professional but not too formal, and I'd done my makeup with extra care because I needed the armor of looking put together even though I felt like I was walking toward an execution. The moment I stepped through the side gate into the backyard, Aunt Linda spotted me and rushed over with her arms outstretched, and she hugged me so long and so tightly that I could barely breathe, pulling back to look at me with these sad, compassionate eyes and saying, "Oh, sweetheart, it's so brave of you to come. I know this must be hard." I started to respond, but Uncle Tom was already there clapping me on the shoulder saying, "Tough job market out there, Sarah. But don't give up. Something will come through eventually. You just have to keep applying." And I opened my mouth to correct him, to tell him I wasn't looking for a job because I had one. But then Cousin Beth was hugging me and saying, "I was unemployed for 6 months once and I survived. You will too. It gets better." Every single interaction for the next 30 minutes followed the same pattern, relative after relative approaching me with pity in their eyes, and I kept trying to explain that I wasn't unemployed, that I was senior director at a tech company in Seattle. But they would smile and nod in this placating way that made it clear they thought I was in denial or making things up to save face. I watched Marcus across the yard trying to help me, telling Aunt Caroline that I was actually very successful, and she patted his arm like he was a sweet but naive child and said, "That's lovely that you support your sister. Family is so important during difficult times." My mother circulated through the party playing the role of concerned parent beautifully, accepting condolences and sympathy about her struggling daughter with this brave, resigned expression. And every time someone expressed concern, she would say something like, "We're just taking it day by day. She's very sensitive about it, so please don't press her." The peak of the humiliation came around 1 o'clock when my mother's sister Diane called for everyone's attention and announced that she'd organized a collection to help me through this difficult time, and she walked over with an envelope saying, "We all contributed what we could. It's $470. We know it's not much, but we wanted you to know we're here for you." And she pressed it into my hands, while the entire backyard full of relatives watched me with sympathetic eyes like I was a charity case, like I was someone to be pitied rather than a professional who made more money than most of them combined. I stood there holding the envelope of pity money, and something inside me that had been bending for 3 years finally broke, not with anger or rage, but with absolute clarity. and I heard myself say in a voice that was calm and steady, "I need to say something to everyone." The backyard conversations faded to silence, and 53 relatives turned to look at me, and I saw my mother's face go pale as she stepped forward, saying, "Sarah, sweetie, you don't have to make a speech. We're just here to have a nice time." But I was already speaking, the words coming out clear and factual without emotion, because this wasn't about emotion anymore. It was about truth. "I am not unemployed," I said, and I watched people exchange uncomfortable glances like they thought I was about to have some kind of breakdown. I have not been unemployed since I graduated from college 7 years ago. I have been continuously employed in my field, I have been promoted 3 times, and as of last week, I am Senior Director of Digital Strategy at Cascade Technologies in Seattle, and I make $215,000 per year. The silence that followed was absolute, and I could see Aunt Linda opening her mouth to say something gentle and placating. And she did, her voice so kind it almost broke me. "Sarah, honey, it's okay. We're not judging you. Unemployment happens to everyone." And I cut her off by pulling out my phone and saying, "I'm going to show you all something because apparently words aren't enough." My mother took a step toward me with her hand outstretched, saying, "This is not the time or place for this, Sarah. Please don't make a scene." And I looked at her directly for the first time all day and said, "Mom, when is the time? I have tried to tell you for 3 years. I have told you at Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter and every phone call in between. When exactly would be the right time for you to listen to me?" I walked through the crowd toward the house, and everyone parted to let me through, and I could feel them following me inside, where the big TV was set up for the slideshow my mother had planned for later. And I connected my phone to it with hands that were perfectly steady because I had passed through nervousness into something that felt like inevitability. The first image filled the screen, the photo I'd taken in my corner office just 2 weeks ago, and there I was behind my desk with floor-to-ceiling windows showing the Seattle skyline behind me and my nameplate clearly visible in the foreground reading Sarah Mitchell, Senior Director of Digital Strategy. And I heard someone gasp and someone else say, "Oh my God," very quietly. And I stood beside the TV and looked at my mother's face and watched her expression shift from dismissive concern to something like dawning horror as she began to realize what was about to happen. The family crowded around the TV screen, and I watched them staring at my corner office photo with expressions shifting from confusion to shock. And I swiped to the next image, which showed me on stage at our company's annual keynote presenting to an audience of more than 300 people. The Cascade Technologies logo massive behind me, and my title displayed on the lower third of the screen. And I said in a voice that was calm and factual, "This was in March when I presented our Q1 digital strategy to the entire company." I swiped again, and there was my published article in Tech Strategy Journal, the leading industry publication, my byline clearly visible above the title, "Innovative Approaches to Cross-Platform Digital Integration," and I said, "This was published in January." They invited me to contribute based on the campaign I led that generated $4.2 million in revenue for our client. The next image was my LinkedIn profile, and I zoomed in so they could see my title, my company, the 537 connections, and I scrolled down to show the recommendations from executives at major corporations, people with titles like Chief Marketing Officer and VP of Digital Innovation, all of them praising my strategic thinking and leadership, and someone in the crowd whispered, "Oh my God." I swiped to the screenshot of the email from Rebecca, my boss, the one from last week that said, "The board has approved your promotion to Senior Director effective November 1st, salary $215,000. Congratulations on this well-deserved recognition." And I let them read it in silence before moving to the next photo, which showed me sitting on a panel at the Tech Innovation Conference in San Francisco, my nameplate visible on the table in front of me, identifying me as a featured speaker. I showed them my conference badge from the Digital Strategy Summit, where attendance cost $3,000 and was by invitation only. And then I pulled up the final image, which was a pay stub from September, with all my personal information redacted except my name, my title, and the deposit amount that clearly showed my biweekly salary. The room was absolutely silent, except for my voice, as I narrated each piece of evidence like I was presenting a case to a jury, which in a way I was. And each image landed with weight that I could feel in the shifting energy of the crowd. Uncle Tom was the first to speak, and his voice came out rough and shocked when he said, "Sarah, I had no idea. I truly had no idea." And Aunt Linda turned to my mother with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something that looked like anger, and she said, "You told me she was unemployed. You said she'd been out of work for months." My mother's face had gone from pale to flushed, and she was shaking her head, saying, "I didn't know. She never told me. I thought it was just computer stuff. I didn't realize it was this serious." And I felt something cold settle in my chest as I said very clearly, "I told you, Mom. I told you dozens of times over 3 years." Marcus stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the back, and he looked at our mother with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, and he said, "She did tell you, Mom. I was there. I heard her tell you at Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter. We all stopped hearing her." I stood there in front of the TV screen with my family crowded around me, and I realized that showing them the evidence wasn't enough, that I needed to speak the actual timeline of my invisibility out loud so they could hear exactly how long this had been happening. And I turned to face my mother directly as I said, 3 years ago in September, I was hired as digital strategist at Cascade Technologies at a starting salary of $95,000, and I called you the day I got the offer because I was so excited. And you told your friends I was doing freelance computer things. My voice was steady and clear, and I watched her face as I continued. 2 years ago in March, I was promoted to strategy manager, and my salary increased to $135,000. And I told you at Easter dinner that year, and you asked me when I was going to get a real job like teaching or nursing. I could feel the weight of 53 relatives watching this unfold, and I kept going because now that I'd started, I couldn't stop. Last year in June, I was promoted to Director of Digital Strategy at $180,000, and I drove home specifically to tell you in person, and you fell asleep on the couch while I was explaining what the promotion meant. Someone in the crowd made a small sound of dismay, but I didn't look away from my mother's face as I said, "Last month, when you needed $3,000 for car repairs, I sent you a check for the full amount, and Marcus sent you $200, and you called him to say thank you, and you never called me at all." And I heard Marcus make a rough sound behind me, but I kept going. "Last week, I was promoted to senior director at $215,000, and I told you at dinner the night before the reunion, and you laughed and said I didn't have to make things up, that this was family." And my voice finally wavered on that last word, but I steadied it as I said, "Every single milestone, every achievement, every success over 3 years, and you dismissed all of it." My father finally spoke up, and his voice sounded defeated when he said, "Sarah, we didn't know it was this serious." And I turned to look at him for the first time and said, "Dad, you were there for every single one of those conversations. You sat at that table at Easter when she asked about real jobs. You were on the couch when she fell asleep while I was talking. You knew exactly how serious it was. You just didn't stop her." The silence that followed was crushing, and I turned back to the assembled relatives and held up the envelope of money they'd collected and said, "I appreciate the kindness behind this. I really do. But I don't need financial help. I make more than almost everyone in this room, and I'm going to donate this $470 to a job training program for people who are actually facing unemployment and who actually need support." Then I looked directly at my mother and said the thing I'd needed to say for 3 years. "I needed you to be proud of me, Mom. I needed you to see me as I actually am. And instead, I spent 3 years trying to earn something that I should have had freely just by being your daughter. And the worst part is that you made me feel like I was failing when I was actually succeeding beyond anything I'd imagined for myself." My mother's face crumpled and tears started streaming down her cheeks as she said, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought you were exaggerating, making yourself sound more important than you were." and I stared at her, feeling something cold and heavy settle in my chest as I asked, "Why would I do that? Why would you think I would lie to you about my own life?" She wiped at her face with shaking hands and said, "Because I did, Sarah. When I was your age, I made my job sound bigger than it was. I told people I was an office manager when I was really just a secretary. I made everything sound more impressive because I was ashamed, and I thought you were doing the same thing." The confession hung in the air between us, and I felt the pieces clicking into place, understanding finally why she'd dismissed every achievement, and she continued in a broken voice. "I didn't understand anything about the tech industry, all those terms you used and the things you described. None of it made sense to me, and instead of asking you to explain it or trying to learn about your world, I just decided it couldn't be real because I couldn't comprehend it." I watched her standing there in front of 53 relatives who were all witnessing her breakdown, and I realized that she'd reduced my success to fantasy because she couldn't validate what she didn't understand, that her own insecurity had made her incapable of seeing me clearly, and the revelation didn't make the hurt disappear, but it gave it context. The relatives around us were shifting uncomfortably, and I could feel their collective realization that they'd enabled this dynamic by believing her narrative without ever asking me directly about my life, and Aunt Linda was the first to break the uncomfortable silence when she stepped forward and said, "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have called you myself instead of believing secondhand information. I should have asked you directly about your job instead of just accepting what your mother told me." Her apology opened the floodgates, and suddenly other voices were joining in with their own awkward but genuine apologies. Uncle Tom saying, "I'm proud of you, kid. What you've accomplished is really impressive. And I'm sorry I offered you a retail job when you're running digital strategy for a major tech company." And Cousin Beth adding, "Can you actually explain what you do? I mean, really explain it? Because I'd like to listen for real this time." I felt something loosening in my chest at their words, and I nodded at Beth, but my focus returned to my mother, who was still crying and who looked smaller somehow than she had an hour ago, diminished by the weight of what she'd done, and I knew that this moment right here was the pivot point where our relationship would either begin to heal or break completely. I gestured toward the house, and my mother followed me inside, away from the crowd of relatives who were still processing everything they'd just witnessed. And we ended up in the kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast as a child, and where she'd packed my lunches for 12 years of school, and where everything should have felt safe, but instead felt like foreign territory. She was still crying, and her hands were shaking as she said, "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I made you invisible because I couldn't see past my own insecurities." And I leaned against the counter, feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, and said, "I needed my mother to believe in me. I needed you to see me and be proud of me without me having to prove myself in front of 53 people. And instead, you made me spend 3 years earning something I should have had just by being your daughter." She wiped at her face and asked, "How do I fix this? Tell me how to fix what I've done." And I looked at her for a long moment before I said, "You start by actually listening when I talk about my life, by asking questions instead of making assumptions, by being proud of who I actually am instead of who you think I should be." We stood there in that kitchen for 20 minutes, having the most honest conversation we'd had in years, painful and necessary and raw. And she admitted that she'd felt left behind by my success, that the tech world was completely foreign to her and made her feel inadequate and old, that she didn't know how to relate to a daughter whose career she couldn't understand. I explained that this wasn't really about the industry at all, but about basic respect, about believing me when I told her things about my own life, about not projecting her insecurities onto my achievements, and I could see her actually hearing me for the first time in 3 years. We didn't resolve everything because that kind of damage doesn't heal in one conversation, but something fundamental shifted between us, and when we walked back outside together, the party had continued without us, and people were eating and talking in smaller groups. My mother did something then that surprised me. She asked me in front of everyone to explain what I actually do at my job. And so I stood there in the middle of the reunion and described leading a team of 12 digital strategists, developing campaigns that generate millions in revenue, speaking at industry conferences, and consulting with Fortune 500 companies on their digital transformation strategies. My family listened with genuine attention this time and asked real questions about my work. Uncle Tom wanting to know about specific campaigns I'd led, and Cousin Beth asking about the Tech Innovation Conference. And I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt since I'd started this job 3 years ago. Marcus hugged me before he left and said, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner. I see it now, and I'll do better." And I hugged him back because he wasn't the villain in this story, just someone who'd been blind to a dynamic that didn't directly affect him. 3 months later, my mother drove to Seattle for the first time ever, and I gave her a tour of my corner office, introduced her to my team, and to Rebecca, who told my mother that I was one of the most talented strategists she'd worked with in 20 years. That evening, we had dinner at my favorite restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, and my mother asked me real questions about my life, about my work, and my apartment, and my friends, actually listening to my answers and engaging with what I told her. She said, "I have a lot of years to make up for." And I said, "Then let's start now." And I meant it, because holding on to the hurt would only damage me further. Later that night, after I'd driven her back to her hotel, I stood at the window of my apartment, looking out at the Seattle skyline, at the lights reflecting off the water, and the Space Needle rising against the dark sky. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years, a sense of peace with who I was and what I'd accomplished. I'd learned that I couldn't control whether other people saw my worth, but I could control whether I let their blindness define me. And while I was grateful that my family finally understood my success, I knew now that my value had never depended on their validation.